So a good place to start in macroeconomics is with this diagram. So here's one version of this diagram. Here's another version. I prefer looking at this one. So it basically just says, without worrying about government for now, without worrying about the rest of the world for now, some chappie called Frank Knight in around 1930 comes up, well he doesn't say he came up with it, but he published this picture, and everyone calls it Knight's picture, so we'll call it Knight's picture. Anyway, and he says, right, if we've got households and we've got firms, what we have to have in the macroeconomy is households providing resources to firms, firms producing goods and selling those goods back to households. That's the flow of goods and services. And the way that these transactions happen is through money. So what happens is the household will supply land, capital, whatever other resources it has access to the firm. And in exchange, the firm will give wages. Will pay wages for labor, rent for land, interest for capital, and profits go to entrepreneurs. Okay? And in turn, firms will sell goods and services to households, and households will use the money that they earn, the income that they earn, to pay, in other words, expenditure on those goods and services. So we have that blue line which shows which way the money is going, and then we have that grey line which shows which way the goods and services are going. So a moment ago when we looked at that overview of macro, we spoke about different markets, the goods market and the money market, and they are separable because the money market, well, the money side of things is flowing in the opposite direction to the goods side of things. And if we want to, we can, anyway. So this just says, here's GDP, and if we look at the different parts of GDP, okay, we can think about GDP as, if we talk about that circular flow diagram, we can either measure GDP in terms of the income people earn, or we can measure it in terms of the expenditure people make. Because if households are providing goods and services, and firms are making goods and services, households are getting paid an income, and they're using that income to buy the goods and services, the income and the expenditure needs to be equal. Otherwise there's a problem. If we're making things and we're not selling them, well then we need to change what we're making. If we are not earning enough, right? Well, if we're not earning enough, then we're not going to be selling enough, right? In other words, if we don't pay people for the stuff that they make, how can they buy it? So there has to be this flow of goods and services exchanged through money. And this is at an average level, in other words, at the aggregate, which is to say I might pay you a little bit and pay that person a lot. What that means is when the two of you come together and make something, unfortunately, person number one is only going to be able to buy a small amount of it, and person number two is going to be able to buy a large amount of it, right? Which obviously then brings about questions of relative pay and things like that, and we can get there. We can have those exciting conversations. But if we look at GDP and we measure it in terms of expenditure, what we've got, if we follow these orange lines, is here we've got consumption, here we've got government purchases, here we've got investment, and here we've got net exports. So we add these orange lines together and we get the expenditure approach to measuring GDP. You with me? And then if GDP is sitting there, well, if it's going to get that, what we just looked at was the spending side of it. We could also look at where does it go before it gets spent. In other words, who earns it, right? So GDP, in terms of an income approach, well, people get paid wages. Rents get paid to landowners. Interest gets paid to capital owners. Dividends and other forms of income. And if we follow this income trail, we can go around. Some of it goes to households, some of it goes to government, some of it goes to businesses. Thereafter, it must go from businesses back, or from households back. In other words, it must go from an income and become an expenditure. Yeah? These are just broad concepts at the moment. We'll get into the very specifics of what all of this is in a moment. So that's a broad overview of the subject matter.